Are there parts of your past that you struggle to let go of, even though you know that they're holding you back? Do you feel stuck in the same emotional patterns despite being in therapy for a while? How often do you allow yourself to sit with your pain instead of distracting yourself from it? Have you ever wondered why certain memories or traumas still activate you even after a lot of time has passed? Are there painful experiences in your life that you avoid fully acknowledging and processing? As a widow and a survivor of various traumas as a child, grief is a deeply personal topic and something many people overlook or even avoid on their healing journeys, whether it's the loss of a loved one, the end of a relationship, or moving to a new home or transitioning to a new job, or even letting go of a past version of ourselves. Grief is something that we all experience frequently. It's a natural part of life. And when you can embrace it into your healing journey and you welcome how transformative and healing grief is, then you open yourself up to its power and to its gifts. But we live in a world that pushes us to move on, to stay strong. And so a lot of people don't even understand grief, and they haven't been taught how to truly grieve. The truth is, neglecting to fully process our grief keeps us stuck because it prevents us from fully processing what needs to be processed in order to heal and make space for that healing. What's most misunderstood about grief is that it isn't just about death. It comes with all forms of loss and change and transition. And when we avoid it, we hold on to the pain or the guilt or the shame or whatever unresolved, unprocessed emotions that then hinder our brains and our bodies from healing and moving beyond that experience, integrating that experience that are connected to those emotions. And so in this episode, we're going to explore why grief is essential to deep, authentic healing, and how embracing it and making it a prominent part of your healing process is going to open up new layers of self-love and self-acceptance and clarity and wisdom and joy and peace and freedom. Welcome to The Simple Source, your source for all things self-love, self-healing, personal growth, and spirituality. I'm your host, Linda Valines. I used to be chronically sick and unhappy. I spent years trying anything and everything to heal, but I never got better. It wasn't until my late husband was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer that I finally stopped searching for the answers outside of myself and turned within. I taught myself how to truly love and heal myself, how to finally be authentically healthy and happy, mind, body, and soul. I have over 10 years of personal and professional self-healing and teaching experience. I'm a trauma-informed, certified holistic health and wellness coach, certified Ayurveda counselor, and author. I healed myself of a lifetime of complex traumas and chronic conditions with joy and ease. Now I'm teaching you to do the same. So if you're ready to heal and love yourself more, mind, body, and soul, without all the struggle and stress, and with more joy and productivity, join me to liberate your highest, healthiest, and happiest self and learn how to thrive more simply. Let's get started with today's episode. So grief has been a massive part of my life and my healing journey. And it's been one of the most impactful aspects of my growth. My husband passed of kidney cancer 8 years ago. And that journey of grief was life-changing and life-improving. It taught me that grief is an expression and an extension of love. Grieving is loving. And in my grief journey, after my husband passed, that's when I understood the innate connection that we all have to the universe, how everything is connected. And that's when I began my spiritual awakening. And that's when life became really, truly magical, was in that grief, was in my connection to Matt and being available to his presence post-death and learning what was beyond the veil and allowing myself to feel all the pain, all the sorrow, and also all the love and the joy, because I think grief is such a unique healing process because it takes you through all of these stages. It's so transformative in and of itself that when you fully give yourself to grief, you really do evolve so much, and there's so much learning and there's so much to be gained that when you do productively and authentically grieve, on the other side of that grief, you are inevitably a new version of yourself, a more evolved, a more healed version of yourself. And that's not to say that my grief in terms of Matt passing is done and I have grieved everything that needs to be grieved, because I also think that those types of, I don't want to call it a loss, because I don't think that it is. I mean, of course it sucks. Like, it's completely awful that he's not physically here, but he's not gone. We're still in contact and he's still a part of my life. And that grief, I know, is going to be with me for the rest of my life because I will never stop loving Matt. I will never stop loving him. And I do think that grieving is an extension of love. And the grief, of course, is dependent on the severity of the death or the transition or the loss or whatever. And Matt was such a pivotal, transformative relationship and era of my life that, of course, it will always be momentous. It will always be so deeply impactful. And I'm so grateful for that. I want to be available for that. I want it to continue to show me deeper aspects of who I am and more profound aspects of living and the universe. I want to continue to be available for that. So I will always be available for that grief for the rest of my life. And I think that's one of the many incredible things that grief grants us, the many gifts that grief grants us, is this ongoing window into the truth, the depth, the mystery and the adventure and the complexity and also the simplicity of existence, and that we are all truly so connected. And the more that we can connect to our grief, which is connecting to ourselves and then in essence connecting with everything, the more that we do heal and evolve, because we are in grief through that love, through the journey of all of its stages. We do inevitably come home to a more authentic version of ourselves, and that's what healing is. So I also had a very tumultuous childhood, and so there was a lot of grief. I didn't understand it at the time, but there was so much grief in my childhood because there was so much trauma and there was so much pain and heartbreak, and I didn't have the tools and the knowledge that I do now to fully process it, but there was always a sense of loss growing up because there was so much loss of innocence and safety and joy and my dreams, etc. And so in recognizing, I've been revisiting John Bradshaw's work. I love him. I think his work is just so beautiful and so poignant and so profound and so good. So revisiting his work, I made a decision to have an inner child summer, a summer devoted to my inner child so that she could feel seen and loved. And so we could both achieve a deeper layer of healing. And so I had a magical summer and it was so healing. And so I've actually extended. So now it's become my inner child remainder of the year. But I've been doing so much grief work in the past few months, and it's been so life-changing and life-improving as well. And that's why I wanted to talk about grief. Grief is essential to genuine healing. It's essential to forgiveness. It's essential to self-love. And embracing grief not only deepens our connection with ourselves, but of course it deepens our connection to other people and to our existence. It allows us to fully process our experiences, and that makes room for more healing physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. Grief is a universal experience. Every single transition in life involves some sort of grief. Whether or not you're conscious of it, there's grief to be grieved. Whether that's the end of a relationship, a career change, some sort of personal transformation, we have to grieve that transition in order to remain whole, in order to productively evolve, in order to remain in our authenticity, in order to heal. So experiences that we have to grieve include, but are not limited to, childhood trauma and unmet needs in childhood. Any trauma, in fact, needs to be grieved. Any unfulfilled dreams or goals, the loss of health, the loss of vitality, or some sort of physical ability or one of the senses, like losing sight, hearing, major transitions in life, like moving, even getting married, because you're transitioning from one era of your life into a different era of your life, like single to married. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff there. Any change in family dynamics, like when you become estranged with certain family members. Also, of course, infertility, miscarriages. Another one is spiritual loss, like a crisis of faith. And grief also comes with not just physical death, but figurative death, like the death of what was familiar, the death of what was comfortable, the death of unhealthy patterns within yourself. That all needs to be grieved. Grief is such a natural part of the human experience for a reason, because it's so healing and it's so liberating, and yet so many people avoid it. And I think that's because grief involves confronting deep emotional pain, which often feels really overwhelming for people. And that's why people avoid grief, because they fear that they're going to be consumed by the sadness, the anger, the despair. A lot of people have trauma responses that are rooted in maintaining a sense of strength, like I'm strong, I'm resilient, nothing touches me. And so they want to appear like strong by moving on really quickly after a loss or a death or some sort of transition. But that's just emotional suppression. That's not you really moving on at all. And I think people also lean into spiritual bypassing too. And that's, so if you're part of that high vibes only club, you tend to avoid difficult emotions like grief because you're scared that it's going to detract you from your ability to stay positive and high vibe. And I also think that grief requires vulnerability, which is uncomfortable for a lot of people. And I think a lot of people feel the need to be in control, which is a trauma response. And a lot of people fear judgment from other people, and that inhibits people from grieving. And because grief can be perceived as a sign of weakness. Feeling is often perceived as a sign of weakness still at this day and age. And I think some people avoid grief because they fear that they won't be able to control it, which is sort of what I said a little bit earlier, but like grieving will then lead to an emotional breakdown, because then you just like open the floodgates, and then they don't know how to manage their feelings. And a lot of people have unresolved trauma that they want to avoid, and grief is a part of that trauma. And, they don't have the knowledge or the tools. And so those emotions are going to activate old wounds and past pains, and that all feels very intimidating, too difficult to face. And I think also some people feel guilty about grieving because they believe that they don't have the right to feel sad. about something. I also think grieving can signify or make real the finality of a loss, whether that's a death or the end of a relationship or some other significant life change. Facing that grief means that you accept that things are never going to be the same, which can be difficult for some people and for some circumstances. Also, I think people don't like appearing like they failed. And so there's like an unconscious belief that grieving indicates that they have failed, like failed at keeping the relationship, failed at achieving that goal. And so that also makes people resist grieving. There's so many misconceptions about grief too. People don't understand that grief is more than just about death, and that it is applicable to any change and any loss, regardless of how big or small. And so without that understanding, a lot of people, they don't even know that they should be grieving those life experiences and those transitions. And so if any of that resonates with you, this is your invitation to welcome grief into your life and into your healing and growth journey, because by avoiding grief, consciously or unconsciously, you actually deny yourself the opportunity to heal and to grow and to move forward in your life in a genuinely less encumbered and more authentic way. Grief is an alchemical process that transforms us at the deepest levels. It allows us to shed those old versions of selves and those outdated narratives and those unhealthy identities and those attachments that no longer serve us. Just as alchemy turns base metals into gold, grief breaks down your emotional defenses and it creates the space for true transformation to happen. That's why it's so healing. It is the alchemy of one state of existence into another through all of these stages of transformation. And what you arrive at or end up with is gold. So by fully embracing grief, what happens is you transmute your pain into wisdom. You transmute your sorrow, your loss into love, into gratitude. And then you open yourself to even more possibilities of healing because you've expanded your capacity to love, to feel joy. You've made your life and your existence and your connectedness more clear. You're more attuned to your purpose. Grief is such a sacred process that is always going to lead to profound growth and liberation of your authentic self. And I don't think that people understand that enough. And when you embrace grief in all the various aspects of your life, embracing grief in various aspects of my life has helped me understand not only how necessary it is for healing and growth, but it really has connected me to the magic and the love and the support of the universe. And it's allowed me to tap into that connection with so much confidence and to feel safe in that connection and to feel held. And ultimately, too, to resolve in many ways one of the greatest fears that most people have, which is of death. That fear of death drives so much unconscious self-sabotaging and unhealthy patterns and behaviors and limiting beliefs. But when you grieve, you do come closer to death because you are, in essence, acknowledging some sort of death, literal or figurative, often figurative. And then you become accustomed to the truth. You become comfortable with the truth that death is a natural and necessary part of life, literal and figurative death. We die a little bit every single day in order to be reborn the next day, to be renewed, to rejuvenate. That's the process. Every single moment, there are trillions of cells that are dying so that trillions of new cells can be made. There is no life without death. And when we embrace that, we learn to let go in such a profound and genuine way. We learn that letting go is also a natural part of life and nature And the only thing constant in life is change, is impermanence, is that transitory function of all things. Everything is in constant motion. Our cells, our protons, nothing is static. Nothing is truly ever stuck in the sameness. So when we grieve, we tap into that natural rhythm, that natural cycle, that natural movement, that transition and evolution that is inherent in the nature of everything in existence. And that's why grief is so empowering, because when we grieve, we align with our most fundamental function of evolving. And that's why grieving lets us move forward with so much more conviction and purpose and clarity and truth and freedom, because we have released the past. And that's also why grief allows us to forgive so much more easily, to forgive ourselves and to forgive others more easily, more authentically. That's why grief allows us to know ourselves more and to foster healthier relationships with ourselves, which then allows us to have healthier relationships with other people, because we're not holding on to unnecessary baggage and emotions and energy and stories and burdens. We have evolved. That's one of the biggest lessons that I've learned in my own grief journey, is that in letting go, you actually receive so much that you want. It's the holding on, it's the resistance to change, to transition, to death, literal or figurative, the resistance to evolve. That doesn't serve us in any way. That holding on, that resistance to feeling and acknowledging and accepting and forgiving and the holding on to all the stories and the narratives and the beliefs and the identities, that holding on is such a drain physically, mentally, and emotionally. And when I grieved Matt's cancer and his death so intentionally, so purposefully, so beautifully, and I opened myself up to all of it, there was so much release. That's what was one of the most beautiful healing aspects of that grieving. Also, too, in grieving my childhood traumas and, all my traumas that I grieve, it's the release that's so empowering and so illuminating and enlightening, and what begets peace afterwards. That's the reward. Is that when you do have the courage to meet yourself, to love your pain, and to feel all of it, you're so much lighter at the end of that journey. You're so much more attuned to your truth and also to your divinity, because you have expanded your capacity to exist fully. And that's why grief is so essential for healing traumas. That's why my grief after Matt passed was so productive, because that was so traumatic. Of course that was traumatic. He died in an awful way. Not to say that death in any way is less awful than another way. I mean, I suppose there is a spectrum, but cancer is a brutal fucking way to go, especially a beast of a cancer like kidney cancer. And, watching my husband vomit blood for like 3 hours as he passed, that was fucking horrible. It was so traumatic. And I had to grieve that in order to process that trauma. I had to grieve that experience of what that death was in terms of what I actually wanted it to be. It would have been great if he had a peaceful, serene death where he just went quietly. But no, it was grotesque. It was fucking awful. And so I had to grieve that. And in grieving that, I released that trauma. I released the emotions and the tension, and then I could be free of it and then get to the beautiful aspect of his passing, which is the profound appreciation of the love and our relationship and what he taught me, and that we're still connected, we'll always be connected, all of those beautiful things. That's why grief is so fundamental for healing trauma, because trauma affects us so holistically. And I hope that you listen to my trauma episode so that you understand how holistic trauma is, and what it is the response to an event. But then because we are holistic beings, our nervous systems are connected to everything. And of course, then our physical and emotional and mental, and then thus our spiritual existence is affected by trauma. We have to grieve all of it, not just the event itself, but then the loss of safety, the loss of trust, our needs not being met, our wants not being met. If it's childhood, our loss of innocence or belonging or whatever it is, we have to grieve all of those things. And when we do, that's when the healing of the trauma becomes really productive and also holistic, because you've acknowledged all of those losses, all of those pains, and then you're showing up for your healing process in a really authentic way. Because grief not only allows us to release those stored emotions from those traumas, but it also prevents those traumas from being trapped in our minds and in our bodies. Because when we process grief, we engage the body and the brain in healing, which is so essential for productive trauma resolution. Again, it has to be a holistic process because healing has to be holistic. We're holistic beings. So grieving isn't just a somatic in the body experience, but what happens is it also rewires neural pathways out of that survival mode narrative and then towards emotional regulation and equilibrium or homeostasis and ultimately resilience. And that's what you want. Because what happens is grief activates the brain's limbic system, particularly the amygdala, which processes emotions like fear, sadness. And then it also activates the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for emotional regulation. And so then we're fully engaged in the processing, right? And that's why grief then helps those regions in the brain to work together to regulate our emotions instead of staying stuck in that nervous system dysregulation, fight, flight, freeze, fawn, whatever. And then over time, as we continue to invest in the grieving process and we allow ourselves to grieve deeply and completely, that emotional processing, because it's so holistic and because it's complete, eventually rewires those neural pathways through neuroplasticity. And then that shifts the brain away from those reactive trauma-based responses towards greater emotional balance and regulation. And so that's how trauma resolution and holistic healing happen, by integrating both the body's somatic responses and the brain's adaptive capacity. That capacity is also why grieving allows you to expand your ability to feel joy and bliss. Our ability to feel joy is directly tied to our ability to feel grief, because by expanding one, we innately expand the other. And that's because grieving productively enhances heart-brain coherence. If you follow Joe Dispenza's work, you probably have heard of that term. And that's just the harmonious alignment between the heart and the brain, right? The heart's rhythm and the brain's emotional and cognitive processes. So grief allows your brain and your heart to communicate together effectively and coherently. So when we allow ourselves to grieve fully, we engage that heart-brain pathway, and that creates greater emotional depth and self-awareness and authentic emotional expression. That heart-brain coherence then, right, when the heart and the brain are working harmoniously together, then that promotes more emotional regulation and deeper integration of feelings that then enables us to experience our emotions more fully and more authentically. So that's why the more we allow ourselves to grieve, the greater our capacity to experience joy and love and thus connection. And so I hope that you understand grief more clearly and why it's so critical to productive and genuine healing. But we also have to know how to grieve productively. That's huge. Some people get lost in their grief, and grief does become all-consuming. and then adversely affects their lives because they don't have the emotional tools, the self-awareness, the understanding that we are not our emotions and that we can feel without becoming our feelings. So we can regulate our grief in the same way that we can regulate anything about ourselves, whether that's an emotion, a thought, or behavior. Now, that's not to say that we should control how we grieve, but grief doesn't need to be something that takes over our lives. Now, obviously, sure, if someone you deeply love has recently passed, the severity of that grief is acute, and that's going to come up and surface whenever it comes up and wants to surface, and you don't have control over that, and you shouldn't suppress that. But many people get lost in their grief, and their lives become dull because they're not moving through the evolution, through the stages, through the process of grief. And so they're like stuck in a stage for a lot longer than is healthy. And then the grief doesn't become productive because it's not complete. So a productive, healthy, and complete grieving journey and process is one that moves through all stages of grief at some point or another. And oftentimes, some stages are more prominent than others, but until you feel all your feelings and you process everything that needs to be processed, you haven't fully grieved. And that's why so many people are stuck in the same emotional patterns, getting activated by the same trauma and acting out the same trauma responses. It's because their grief process is not only present, but it's not productive or complete. So if you want to embrace grief as a fundamental aspect of your healing practice, which I highly recommend that you do, you have to incorporate intentional and specific grieving into your healing practice. That means feeling all of your feelings, allowing yourself to grieve everything that you felt you lost or lost out on or betrayed by or disappointed by, all the times that you felt unseen, unloved, or you were shamed, you felt not good enough, all the times that your heart hurt in some way. Wherever there is pain, there's grief to be felt, because grief is not, again, just about the loss and transition. It's about allowing ourselves to feel the absence of what we wanted, whether that was to feel safe or seen or loved. So here's your action step for the week. I want you to determine something that still brings up an emotional response in you, whether that's anger or frustration or shame, and then ask yourself what you needed in that experience that's connected to that emotion, what you needed that you didn't get, and then allow yourself to grieve the thing that you didn't get. And then allow yourself to move through all the stages of grief. So really quickly, the stages of grief are denial, the shock, the disbelief. So you have to acknowledge how you have avoided or rejected that experience. And then there's anger, feelings of frustration, aggression, resentment. Sometimes that anger is toward yourself. Sometimes it's towards another person, even the situation itself. Then there's bargaining. That's when you having to acknowledge how you wanted to reverse or even minimize the situation, how you wanted it to be different. Then there's depression, which of course is the sadness, the feelings of hopelessness, the emotional pain. And then hopefully, as you've allowed yourself to move through all of that and release all of those various aspects that were present and relevant, then you will arrive at acceptance, at the peace, at the breath, at the freedom of knowing that what was done and that you can't change it, but you can change how you relate to it now and how much love you give yourself and love you give that situation. And through that grieving process and acceptance, you're going to inevitably arrive at the meaning and the lesson for you in that situation. And that is the gift of grief, which is understanding how it was intended to help you grow, how it was intended to help you evolve into your highest self with an expanded capacity to love, to live, and to know your true self. I hope that you grieve. Grief has been one of the most transformative aspects and rewarding aspects of my healing journey. And I continue to experience the truth that the more that I grieve, the more that I heal, and the more joy and magic I make space for in my life, because I have productively let go of what I needed to let go of, and then arrived at a true place of presence and power. And I hope that you meet me there, friend. Thank you so much for joining me today in The Simple Source. I hope this episode has inspired you, reminded you of your healing power, and reawakened you to who your true and highest self is. If the show has empowered and enlightened your self-love, growth, and healing journey, please share this episode, leave a positive review on Apple or Spotify, and subscribe to be reminded of new episodes. I am so grateful for your presence, and all of your comments and your support are seen and read and deeply appreciated. They really do help this show so much. Also, sign up for my newsletter, The Weekly Source, to get more healing tips, motivation stories, and to get to know me better. And if you haven't read my book, Unconditional, You Are Perfect As You Are, I invite you to get your copy today and start reading. And lastly, I would love to see you inside my Source membership, the only holistic and comprehensive step-by-step self-healing program that is proven to work. It's time to stop struggling to heal and time to learn how to thrive more simply and joyfully. All the links are in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me today, and I will see you next time.